Welcome to Craig and the Magical Deck Part 2. If you haven't already watched Part 1, check the link down below. First, weeks and then months had passed since Craig had his wild journey in that other dimension. Over time, it almost seemed as if the memories seemed to fade. It seemed less real, perhaps like something he had dreamed or only imagined. Craig's parents seemed to have completely forgotten about the fact that they had been abducted by a strange green creature, and Craig had rescued them and brought them home. Craig didn't understand how they had forgotten, but it didn't feel real to him. And the weeks became months, and finally, around summer break, he had sort of forgotten about the whole ordeal altogether. His mysterious deck of playing cards lay in his closet, unused, unopened, and thankfully unneeded. That summer, something mysterious did start happening, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the Green Goblin or the strange golems or strange dimensions or any sort of magic, at least insofar as Craig knew. Strange earthquakes started shaking around his town. This was an area that had never before had an earthquake. They had never felt one, never heard one, and never experienced one. They were happening. First, once every couple days. Very small earthquakes. Then they started getting larger to the point the houses would actually shake around. They found out through the news that these earthquakes weren't just happening in their town. They were happening all over the state. And then before long, they were being experienced all over the entire United States of America. There was no explanation for these earthquakes. But they did keep getting worse and worse. Craig remembered a particularly bad day where the paintings in their house had all been shaken off the walls, and he heard his mother crying and ran to comfort her. She was worried that their house was gonna fall down. Craig's dad, though he wasn't crying, was obviously very scared. And people were worried. What if they kept getting worse? What would happen? Would people's homes start falling apart? Would skyscrapers fall over? Would giant crevices filled with lava open up in the middle of cities? Nobody knew, but everybody was scared. As this started happening, and as things started getting more and more intense, he couldn't help but hearing that strange green creature telling him, "You have to stop them." He didn't know how or why, but he just knew that this was somehow connected to his deck of playing cards. He went and he got it out of his closet and he looked at it. He still had an exploding card left, the card with rain, the card with thunder. There was a card that showed an eye looking at a misty sort of creature, many others, but nothing stood out. None of them were glowing. There was no messages. There was no means for him to gather any further information. And so he did all he could. He waited. As best he could, he enjoyed his summer. He saw his friends. He went to the park. They went and stayed at a hotel with swimming pools a couple times, which was very fun. Until one fateful night, they were driving home. As his parents pulled up into the driveway, time seemed to stop. For you see, it was raining. And in midair, the raindrops halted and just hovered there. "Whoa, that is weird," Craig said. He assumed it was an optical illusion, something with the raindrops moving too fast, or the way the wind was blowing, or some sort of weird light refraction on the windshield. When he went up to ask his parents, Are you both seeing this?" He found that they were both frozen too. Their chest didn't even rise and fall as if they were breathing. He got out. The wind was still. He couldn't hear any birds. He couldn't hear the sound of wind. He realized for the first time that he could ever remember, he didn't hear the sound of cars driving away on nearby streets. "Oh my God," he said. "Help!" he yelled. He was scared. He didn't know what was happening. He turned around, and in the middle of his cul-de-sac, there was a hole. There had never been a hole here before, especially not one this big. It looked big enough to drive a car through. He crept over on the balls of his feet, ready to turn tail and run at a moment's notice. As he got closer, he could see stairs. He peeked over the edge, and as far as he could see was a staircase descending down into the darkness. "I don't like the looks of this," Craig thought. But he knew he had to go. Time had stopped. He had a feeling of destiny. Somehow this was related to the cards. As quickly as he could, he ran back to the house. He got water, some food, and his deck of cards, stuffed them in his backpack. He also brought a coat and a pair of long pants because he had remembered when his family had traveled to a cave, how cold it was inside. He walked to the edge of the hole once more, looked into it, and said, "Here we go." He took the flashlight off of his belt, pointed it downwards, and started walking. He had hoped, though he had not expected, that the staircase would only go down 10, maybe 15 steps. But he passed 15 steps, and still all he could see ahead was darkness. He passed 30 steps, still darkness remained. 45 steps, still darkness. And down he went, until he had lost count of how many steps he had traversed. When he finally got to the bottom, he could not have told you how many steps he had traversed, although he could have told you it was a lot. He shone his flashlight around. Wherever he was, it was big. When he shined the flashlight up, his light seemed to disappear into the darkness. He could see no ceiling. He shined it all around him, and aside from the wall, by where he had emerged on the staircase, the light disappeared in the distance. This must be a vast cavern. "Hello!" he shouted. He could hear the echo, "Hello, hello, hello," fading into the distance. "Is anyone there?" he called. "Is anyone there? Is anyone there? Is anyone there? Is anyone there? Is anyone there?" And then he heard one sound. At least he thought he did. It was quiet enough he wasn't sure. It sounded like the sound of a stone hitting the cave bottom, and then the soft scuffling of feet moving away. He tried to pinpoint in his mind where he'd heard that sound, and off through the dark he started walking. It felt like he was in a timeless, formless world, because there was nothing but the stone under his feet and the blackness surrounding him. His flashlight would briefly illuminate the blackness on the ground. Other than that, there was nothing. He walked and he walked in the direction where he had heard the sound. After about 15 minutes, he stopped and he realized he had no idea where he was going. He didn't even know if he could get back to the staircase if he wanted to. So again, "Is anyone there?" he called. There was the echo, but no answer. "I need help," he called. There was no answer. Once again, he tried to remember the direction where he had heard the sound from, and again he kept walking in that direction, slowly. Every so often he would call out into the darkness, "Hello? Anyone there? Hello?" But there was nothing. He sat down, and it would not shame him to admit that he cried a little bit. This was a very scary situation. Time seemed to have stopped. He was trapped in a cave deep underground his neighborhood. He had no idea how it had gotten here. He didn't know where he was, and now he didn't know how to get out. And the thing that frightened him most, he had brought a flashlight, but he had not thought to bring extra batteries. How long did the batteries for this flashlight last? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? He didn't know. He sat quietly and just tried to take deep breaths. As he was breathing out, his ears perked up. He heard something. Drip. It sounded like water dripping into a small puddle somewhere. He cupped his hand over his ears to hear better. Drip. Yes, he could hear it. He stood up, put his backpack on, and made his way slowly towards the sound of the dripping water. Eventually, again, in a time he could not describe, he arrived at a small puddle. And he looked up, shone his flashlight, and there was a giant stalactite that was dripping water. Drip, drip, drip. And then he realized, I can see the ceiling. And he started shining his light around everywhere. And as he shone it down, 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 he could see a wall. He could finally see a wall. He rushed over to the wall, hugged it, and kissed it, because he knew if worse came to worse, he could likely follow this wall back to the entrance. But it turned out that was not the most exciting thing. It looked like somebody had carved something into this wall by taking a stone and scraping it along the rock. And it was an arrow pointing to his left. He shined his flashlight on the arrow and started walking that direction. In another 30 feet, he saw another arrow pointing the same direction, so he kept following. He followed until he got to another cave. But this was problematic. This cave After about 5 feet, branched out into about 6 or 7 other caves that went in different directions. He looked at the entrance of all of them. He didn't know which way to go. Until finally, on the ground in front of one of them, he noticed, again, a white mark where it looked like somebody had scraped an arrow into the stone with a rock. Well, that's the best I've got. So he walked, and he walked down a dark, winding, narrow cave. There were points in the cave where the rocks squeezed him so tight, he had to suck in his breath just to squeeze through. There was another part where the ceiling got so low that he had to crouch and even crawl on his hands and knees to get past. But eventually, this cave emerged into another room. But this one was not nearly so big as the last. And this one, believe it or not, had signs of life. In one corner of this room, for strangely it had a squarish shape, was a pile of what looked to be straw or hay with feathers mixed into it. In the other, he saw an old wooden drawer. It appeared to be rotting, whether from water drops or old age, he didn't know. There seemed to be little bits of dirt and stone scattered about, and he even saw one little piece that when he picked up realized was a shard of metal. He shined his flashlight all around. That's all there was. Once again, he called out, "Hello, help, is anyone here into the darkness?" But he received no answer. So he sat down and he ate a protein bar and he tried to think. He knew now he was very deep within this cave. He didn't know if he could find his way out for sure. He thought he could, and he had to make the decision. Go on in faith and hope that he could find the way, or turn back and hope that things would fix themselves. Something in his heart, this little bright flare of bravery, told him he must go on. He knew it was his destiny. So he stood, put his backpack up again, and walked around the room until he found an edge, another edge. And this one was a wooden door half off the hinges. He kicked it and it fell over, and on the other side was another passage. Though it was cylindrical in shape, it looked like it had been mined. How strange. The walls were too smooth in some places and too jagged in others, and the cave moved too perfectly in one direction. There was no way this was a natural cave. His flashlight flickered. He hit it on his hand twice and it lit back up, and he kept walking down the cave. Within 5 more minutes, it flickered again and then went out. His breathing picked up and he squeaked in fear, but he hit the flashlight to his hand again and the light came back on. He walked for another 10 minutes, and this time, when the flashlight turned out, it wouldn't turn back on. Craig once again wouldn't be ashamed to admit that he sat down, buried his face in his hands, and wept. He didn't know how long he had wept, but when he opened his eyes, he knew it must have been a while because they were fully adjusted to the dark. Because up ahead, at the end of this cave, he could see what looked like the flickering of a fire. "That is very strange," he said. But he got to his feet and he ran. Now, the flickering must have been much farther ahead than he had realized, because it took some time, perhaps 20, 25 minutes before he got close enough to see what it was. It was a chamber, large, like the inside of a church or a cathedral, but carved into stone. Lining the walls were candles. There were even pews or benches for people to sit. He looked around. It was a church. Was it an ancient buried church? He didn't know. He walked to the front of the church, and there, upon an altar, was a book. It was dusty, but it wasn't so dusty that he couldn't see the fingerprints on it. He opened it, and inside was a book that was scribed in a language that he did not understand. Right at that moment, the earth shook once more. It was another earthquake. He didn't like being underground during this earthquake. Small stones were falling from the carved ceiling of the cathedral. One hit him in the head, and fortunately it didn't cause him to bleed, but it did hurt. When the earthquake stopped, Craig let out a breath. He hadn't realized how scared he had been. He went back to the book, and once more he tried to read it and browse through the pages. There were pictures he didn't understand, and it was written in a language he didn't understand. The language certainly was not based on Latin or any language he knew. There were strange patterns and shapes scrawled, and as he looked at them, he got a sense of foreboding, a sense of fearfulness. This was not a language of people that he wanted to know. This was not a language or a book that he wanted to read. But still, looking around the cathedral, it seemed as if the cave ended here. There were no other passageways, no doors, no stairs, nothing he could see. He realized perhaps he should check and see if there was anything in his deck that could help. He looked and he flipped through all the cards until finally he found one. It looked like a book that had a question mark scrawled on it, and up above it there were some wavy lines. He took the card out and he tapped it on the book, and much to his surprise, as he did, the card dissipated into a fine gold dust which sprinkled all over the book, glowed brightly, and then disappeared. And much to his surprise, after the glow had dissipated, he could read the book. He started reading it. It was the tale of an ancient warrior. It talked of one who faced startling and terrifying creatures with sword and with shield and with armor of magic. But it also made mention of a deck of cards. In his language, they were called the cards of power. It talked how they were used to defeat great evil, evil that only came to this earth once every 1,000 years or so. It talked of a cathedral, this cathedral where the knights of old had met and stormed off into battle to fight this evil. And finally, at the end of the book, complete with pictures, it told him how to open the gateway to face these evil creatures. It showed a picture of a card that had stone pillars on it, and on top of the stone pillars was a triangle with flame in it. It told him to take that card and put it at the entrance to the cathedral and chant the words, Slababa, Slababa, Slababa. And so before he could get scared, before he could succumb to fear, that is what he did. He went to the entrance to the cathedral, set the card in its appropriate position, and said, Sababa, Sababa, Sababa. As he did so, he heard a grinding, the fierce sound of heavy stone scraping upon heavy stone. The cathedral seemed once more to shake. The ceiling seemed to shake. Small bits of rock fell from the ceiling, covering his shoulders in dust. He closed his eyes and he prayed to the universe, to anyone, to watch out for him. When the scraping had stopped, he looked down the hallway that he had came in. Now there was a staircase leading farther down. Though his flashlight were dead, as he walked down this staircase, he knew he wouldn't need it, because he could see an orange glow that got brighter and brighter and brighter. And when he got to the bottom of the staircase, do you know what he saw? A giant pool of magma off in the distance. A few other smaller pools dotting here and there. And around this giant chamber, he saw holes, the two perfect caves that looked like they'd been carved or mined, going off in every direction. And in the very center of the chamber, he saw 7 machines. They were giant, bigger than any machine he had ever seen. They had treaded wheels like you would imagine on a tank, but on a scale that he had never seen. And on the front, they had drill blades that were as large as buildings. Off into the distance, he could see one of these drilling into the earth. And like lightning, it came to him. The green creature telling him he would have to stop them. His feeling that he needed to be here. The book telling him that there were evil creatures that needed fought. And the earthquakes. This was what was causing the earthquakes. But why? How? Who? Well, these are mysteries that you're going to find out in the next part of Craig and the Magical Deck, which will be our very next story. I want to thank you, everyone who has watched this video, for your time. Feel free to leave me a comment if you did or did not like this story, or like and subscribe. It would also be appreciated. And for you, Alden, I want you to know that I love you, you are in my heart, and I hope you have a most excellent night filled with the sweetest of dreams.